Beth, and this is Megala, and we are trying something a little bit new today. This is exciting. So just for context, the two of us have been kind of developing a friendship for, I would say 5 or 6 months now? Yeah. Going out for coffee. And, we have some things in common. We're both queer. We're both piano players, piano teachers even, but have some things that are different. Like when Megala was quite young, she kind of got kicked out of the church for being a lesbian, whereas I really played it cool and stuck with church the whole time. So Megala's just kind of coming back to that. Another difference, Megala just joined the Army Reserves and I'm more of a pacifist, so there's that. But we wanted to use this final sermon of the series to try this thing called co-preaching, which is really allowing for dialogue and relationship and difference in the midst of our preaching, and kind of avoiding that danger of a single story. So we're going to try this together. We're going to make it a little dialogical. We're going to share some of our own thoughts. Sometimes we're going to agree, sometimes we're going to disagree. But our big idea that we came up with about this passage that Bailey just read, which is the closing of this letter we've been studying from Paul to the Thessalonians, is that Paul is closing with this focus on end times, right? Apocalyptic stuff. And when I think about the end of the world, it can tend to make me afraid, or people can use it to make us afraid and fixated on what, I can do to prepare myself for the future. But we noticed here that Paul is not cooking with fear or with guilt or with even individualism, that kind of I focus in this passage. Instead, he's got this, what we were calling a recipe for end times encouragement, to focus on the present moment, a focus on the work of God instead of my work, and a focus on all of us as a community. So he's more focused on the present than the future. He's more focused on the communal than the individual. And he's more focused on surrendering to God's work than striving to earn some kind of good outcome ourselves. So you can kind of listen for some of those themes, elements of that recipe, ingredients, as we're talking through this passage. So as we just launch into this first part, and if you want to keep the biblical passage handy in your bulletin or maybe in your Bible or on the screen at home, looking at that part about these questions about people who have died, because as a reminder with the context we're looking at, these Thessalonians are being persecuted and sometimes even martyred, and they have a belief that Jesus is coming back right away, like pretty soon. 2,000 years later, we have some different thoughts, but they're wondering, these people who have been killed, are we going to be cut off from them because they're not here to be ushered in by Jesus? So will they be part of this everlasting community? Are they going to miss out on what we're all waiting for? So really, we're already focused on community here. This is already about a community focus by the Thessalonians. And usually, again, we see fear-mongering in these kind of passages, but here, Paul is really encouraging them and reassuring them that their friends will not be left behind, to reference a popular apocalyptic series. So we see already, it's about community and it's about trusting God to bring us together. And Megala really wanted to talk more about the present focus of something that seems very future. So I'm going to do that.
Hello, everyone. I'm Megala. And also, I just have to acknowledge that Kim is here from the Yukon, and she's the Bible scholar, so I'm being a bit nervous, but I'll just pretend that she's in the room. Yeah, it was so, when I first, when Beth first,
Thumbs up.
When Beth first sent me what we were going to be talking about, I almost texted her and said, "Oh, you want to talk about the apocalypse? Excellent!" Because I have been having apocalypse dreams my whole life. I am getting prepared for the zombie apocalypse. That is why I have joined the army. It's so interesting because, of course, I grew up in a church that it seemed like every other weekend we were having the apocalypse and the trumpets were going to sound and we're all going to get taken up into heaven. And except I always knew that I wasn't going to go because I was gay. And you can't go if you are not right with God. Anyway, so there was a whole thing. So I guess the thing that I was thinking about when I read, through that is, that there are maybe some people here that have that experience of feeling like they would be left behind. There was a whole Left Behind movie series back in the day. And I completely admit that I kind of have come back into church sort of via Nadia Bowles-Weber, who is this incredible Lutheran, female preacher. And so she does talk a little bit about the idea that an apocalyptic text like this is code for speaking about the world that the people were living in at that particular time. And so that was what made me think when in reading this, is, if this is still true, then how does this text comment on how we are living right now? And if you look up what apocalypse actually means, it literally means to unveil or to strip away baggage in some way. And so my idea about the present is like, how is God coming into my life and stripping like a thief and taking away some of the baggage that I have already? And the idea of being in the unknowing, like if this idea of, God is coming back imminently. So doesn't that mean that God could be coming back right now? Like, I don't know whether or not, God is here like imminently. And so if I think I know everything, then how am I ever going to be surprised by joy? Right? If I was living right today in what I thought I knew 2 months ago, I wouldn't be here with the person I'm here with. So there's that. So, I do know that in my own life, if I tell people that I want to change, I want God to come in and change things in my life, but do I though? Really? Because if I am going to change, I literally need to have ideas that I have about the world taken away from me, because as much as I say I want to change, when things start to change, that's uncomfortable, right? So like a perfect example out of my own life would be literally until like not even a year ago, I really had this belief that every single evangelical person on the planet was a narrow-minded, bigoted, hateful, batshit crazy person. And you know what? I was so wrong about that. And that was hard for me. I didn't really want to like Beth very much, but I did. And then I came here and I didn't really even think I wanted to like you guys very much. But I do, you're so awesome. So I have to wrestle with that, but I don't think that I did that all on my own though. I do believe that in some way God was kind of hunting me down a bit and like saying, we're gonna just, get you in here and try something different. And for those of you who don't know, I'm in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. I just turned 3, so I'm big into the whole sobriety thing. And I had this friend, Connie, who had a sponsor who used to say, if you feel what you always felt, you're always going to think what you always thought, and then you'll always do what you always did, and nothing will ever change. And so in some way in this passage, what needs to be left behind? What does God need us to leave behind so that we can actually be present to what's actually happening? So
yeah, and I love that present focus of looking at this apocalypse as being kind of apocalypse now in a way. And I think you find comfort in that, and I find comfort in that too. And I think the difference between us is I still kind of have this future hope for something like what Paul is describing, for Jesus coming in some kind of new way with his kingdom. And I'm very agnostic about what that will look like. I think I have a different cosmology than Paul around heaven being up in the clouds in the air. But I think he's drawing on some of this Roman victory imagery and Old Testament prophetic language and some ancient science. But I am really drawn to verse 17, if you've got your passage. And Paul's talking about being gathered together. And I even picture, heaven and earth being gathered together, joining together, and that Jesus is going to be present in a deeper, more everlasting way. That gives me so much hope. And it makes sense of my grief and my injustice to know that that's coming for me. But again, that's the beauty of co-preaching, is that we drew completely different things from this. And I agree with Megala that we need to bring this from the future into the present. It's not about, hunkering down in a bunker and waiting for this to all happen. When we're doing life together in the present, we get to have these appetizers of what's coming. We get to let God bring this transformation in kingdom life into the present, kind of like rushing back. So so bring it back to the work of God in community in the present. That's our recipe that we're trying to bring back. But let's move on to this next part about sobriety and about alertness. One thing we wanted to give as a caveat is we think that passages like this can and have been used to harm some folks, specifically this light-dark imagery. So when light is always shorthand for everything that's pure, everything that's holy, and darkness is always shorthand for everything that's evil that we're trying to avoid, it can be way too easy to think that whiteness, lightness equals godlikeness, and to subconsciously justify things like anti-Black racism with fear of darkness. Megala is really into Jungianism. Am I saying that right? Jungianism. So we started talking about darkness as unconsciousness and light as consciousness, which is part of that system. And, we think there's beautiful things that God does in dark, unconscious spaces like the dark of the tomb, the dark of soil, the dark of the womb. There's this fertile creative potential there. Dark is not bad. But Paul's focus here is on using light as a metaphor for alertness, for staying conscious to something. And he's riffing on these themes from Jesus's parables that are going to be, of course, recorded later, because we learn these letters have actually been written before the Gospels. But stories about bridesmaids keeping their lamps lit until the bridegroom comes, and about servants being ready for their master's return, being sober-minded. So Megala, you just told us you're 3 years sober. I think your cake's coming up this week. So what do you make of this metaphor of sobriety related to this idea of surrendering to God's work in the present and community?
Yeah, like it was such an interesting thing to read that word sober and be like, oh yeah, I kind of know a little bit about sobriety. And I guess for me personally, like a huge part of getting sober, it's so funny when you go I went into sobriety and I'm like, I have this under control. After 2 weeks, I'm like, I'm gonna run AA now. You will not be able to survive without me. And I thought I was like so great. And after about a year, I look back and I'm like, oh, those ladies were so nice to me in that room. I was insane. Like, I was like up, I was like, it's the best thing that's ever happened to me. And then it was like, I hate my life, I made a difference today. But so a huge part of what happened for me in sobriety and in terms of talking to other people that get sober, that's really common, especially in that first year when you kind of are detoxing, is being able to feel things in your body, to have feelings, to tolerate feeling anything. For me, alcohol was a way of numbing and not having to experience what was happening for me. And so it was a solution to problems that I had that I didn't even know I had. And so I think if I look at that in terms of the context here about being awake and sober, how are these people who are not really probably super popular with like the general populace right at the moment, right? Like how are they going to hold on to being able to feel what is happening and to continue to believe in this very odd thing, right? That, and even just listening to that, the reading again, the idea of, when Paul says to, encourage people, don't return harm for harm. Like, we've had 2,000 years of, the New Testament to go, yeah, you shouldn't be a dick, right? But back then they were like, no, man, eye for an eye, I'm coming at you, right? And this must have been a very new concept for people to return like pain with like, no, I'm gonna try to like maybe not retaliate, right? What would it happen if I didn't retaliate with more pain? So I think that's a piece in terms of, having some clarity, and having clarity even if it feels really, really uncomfortable. For me, coming into sobriety was about not being isolated. And this whole passage, this whole thing is talking about how do these people live together in community without killing each other? Like, how do you do that? And so the idea, and again, just to touch on that whole thing about unconsciousness and consciousness, to just really reiterate that all unconsciousness means is it's not conscious, you're not aware of it. It's not better or worse. Being conscious of something doesn't necessarily mean it's better. I'm conscious of a lot of things that are like not great. Like, I think I know what I'm doing, and then something comes up out of my unconscious and I'm like, I've never thought of it like that before. So, that whole idea of the darkness is not bad, the light is not necessarily good. Both are equal in some ways, right? So what I know in sobriety is that the only way that I can actually stay conscious and feel these things is if I am turning my will and my life over to the power of something greater than me. It's like, even at the beginning of this, because you got to find a higher power in AA, like that's kind of a thing, it's part of it, do it. And I just remember being 6 months sober, and this guy was at the tent, he said that his sponsor said to him, you don't have to believe in God, Dave, you just have to believe that you're not God. I'm like, yeah, I can can like probably, like hang on to that, right? So for, it's being able to accept life on life's terms, whatever it is that we're going through.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for throwing in that stuff about retaliation. Like, I think there's definitely hints in the Old Testament about, some things that Jesus was on about. And I think he really drew it out. And I think you're right. They're grappling with this now as a community. I was also reading this week about verse 3, where Paul talks about how, destruction can hit right when people are saying everything is quiet and safe. And in the Greek, it's actually saying peace and security. And that is actually the slogan that was written on Roman coins, peace and security. So the Roman Empire has lulled people into this false sense of security and a temporary kind of peace that's really dependent on violence. So peace and security can actually become idols when we look for them in anyone but God. And this doesn't mean we always have to be braced in fear and thinking like, oh, what's coming? But we can let ourselves rest and trust God. But I think it is a call to stay vigilant. It's a call to question the things that empires might be telling us and listen for the voice of God about what might be happening under the surface. So for me, I'm really passionate right now about climate change. So instead of trusting, some of the people in power in our different levels of government who say, we've got it under control, we're dealing with it, I'm paying attention, I'm staying vigilant to things like, flooding in Pakistan and flooding in Puerto Rico and storms on the east coast of Canada, and how we can work together on a grassroots level to stay alert and to do things to address those things instead of just saying peace and security, it's all here.
Yeah, exactly. Like the whole, we got quite into quite a discussion about that on Wednesday. That whole idea of, I was thinking so much about Mark's sermon the last time we were in this building about how is my Christianity subversive? How am I actually being subversive in this? And I feel like in some ways, the way that I was raised, it was like the Bible was like a Google for Christians. You can find an answer for anything in that thing, right? Like, and it was this very much performative, like these are the rules that you have to follow. And if you don't literally do it the way that we say, then somehow, you're bad. And there's this whole hierarchy, but like, where's the subversiveness in that? Like, where does that leave space for God to come in? And when I think I have everything figured out, that all of a sudden, that's when I'm the most complacent, right? I'm like, oh yeah, I got it all going on. And then God can steal some of those thinky thoughts away from me. And then I can have a different experience, right? Or I get more information. Like there's an evangelical community that is amazing. And so I have to wrestle with that. Like I can't live out that old belief anymore that all evangelicals are awful. And so also the idea of like this countercultural idea of like living in a community, like we live in hermetically sealed boxes where people like come in and out of their garages and like maybe don't even have to talk to the neighbors. And so how is it that we are going to live in community with one another? And I know certainly through sobriety that the opposite of being inebriated is not, or being in addiction is not necessarily sobriety, but like it's not being isolated anymore, it's community. And that's sometimes the only way that we can stay sober, like even if it's not, and that whole thing we talked about even in terms of like alcohol. I mean, alcohol's not bad, it's bad for me because I have a problem and I put in one, it's like 155 later, it's not good. Probably a car crash and stuff. But for other people, it's not about whether you have a glass of wine or not. It's like, how do we stay sober enough to be with one another? How are we able to live in a community when we're taught that we're supposed to be such rugged, individuals, right? And so it just really struck me that so much of what these chapters talk about, and even before this, is about being patient and being encouraging to those who are idle. Like idleness isn't horrible. Like what if idleness stands in for people that are feeling stuck, or they're stagnant, or they're depressed, or they can't get out of bed? How do we help those people? How do we encourage them? How do we be joyful in all things, right? And for me, that's not about like, oh, another bad thing happened. Excellent. I'm going to figure out how to be happy about that, because that's not what joyfulness means. It's about how do I figure out how to say, this is difficult and painful, and here are the places that I can be grateful for the fact that I am breathing, that I have community, that I, even being able to be okay with just sitting in something that feels not okay, right? So totally think it's less about respectability politics and way more about how we can stay right-sized and how we can surrender to something greater than us.
Yeah, and you're taking us into that last part of the letter, right? With the kind of closing instructions, verses 12 to 28. And my reaction to reading that, especially things like be joyful always, pray continually, is like, oh my goodness, this is a to-do list. This could lead to me feeling holier than thou. And the cool thing about talking about a passage with someone is Megala had a very different reaction.
Yeah, like when I have read that in the past, it's like, yeah, well, there's no point. Might as well just give up now because I'm not going to heaven. Like, do not pass go. Don't collect $200 until you fix your tiny lesbian problem. So, I'm not going to be holier than thou. I'm just like, I'm out.
Yeah, it's just like sometimes we just have completely opposite reactions. But again, these aren't messages for individuals. I think that's what you're trying to tell us, Megala, is that it's for a community. So all of these verbs are plural. We do these things together. We rejoice together. We pray together in community. We support each other in it. And we noticed when we were reading that Paul, there's 3 times in this passage he talks about encouraging each other. So this is about what we do together. And this is the work of God in us. In verses 23 and 24 there, it talks about God will do it. God is faithful. And you were going to say a couple more things, I think, about being joyful, right? Because that was the one that really stuck with you.
Yeah, so with this whole thing about like, I'm really realizing this in my sobriety. I have really made a cult of suffering. I am good at it, okay? I can run for 30 hours without sleep. It's like, how much more painful can it get? And I mean, that is kind of funny, but like, I really am, it's gonna sound ridiculous, but I'm trying to surrender into joy. And I think that sometimes that can be really hard because I'm like, am I going to have joy for more than 8 minutes? And so if I'm not, maybe I don't want to feel that. And so trying to trust, surrender into, it is okay to be joyful. I have come from a household in my family, and I have come from a type of Christian religion that is all about the horsehair, like, let's just get out the thing, put our horsehair vest on and a whip and everything. And as long as you're like working really hard and like, it's like, well, it's not too good, then, that's what would make me a good person. And then when I die and go to heaven, that's when I'm going to, all the things are going to be good, except of course I was never going to go. So there was never anything good. It was always going to be about suffering for me. But so, when we get called in this passage to be joyful always, like how do we like surrender to that and say, it is okay to feel happy. It is all right to be joyful, right? And then there was this whole thing about holiness, and like the word holy comes from the root word heilig, or from the German heilig, and it means blessed. That's what it means. The idea that holiness and purity are totally different. Purity is about perfection, and perfection is the highest form of self-abuse. It really, really is. So like if something's pure, it's only one thing. I don't want to be pure because then I only have room for one thing in my life. Like I am a multitude of things, and I really am trying to get used to the idea that I am perfectly imperfect. My girlfriend tells me all the time I'm perfectly imperfect. I'm like, okay, cool. I'm gonna be all right with that, I guess. But there's nothing about purity that allows for the messiness of humanity. But in holiness, we get to be whole, which does embrace humanness. And God is not trying to make us into an angel. God is working with us. I mean, we are the Imago Dei, right? Yeah. So.
Oh, good stuff. So just wrapping this up for y'all, again, it's about now. It's about God's future breaking into our present, a gift for now, not a reward for later. It's about surrendering to the work of God, which can be challenging when we want to be the doers, we want to be the sufferers, the ones that get to do it all. But really, it's about God doing it in us. And it's about all of us in community. This is where we're transformed, when we experience the kingdom life in community. And our question is, how is this happening at Open Way? And can we talk about how we can foster even more of this at Open Way? Will you close us off, Megala?
Yeah. So it's so interesting, like when I was reading the very last part of this chapter, and Paul is really like basically giving, saying, okay, and here's what you can do, and think of us and always, and I've read these passages so many times, as a youngster, like in the church, and it was always so removed from me, like what is this even about? And So we really are like so far away from when this was written. And it's interesting because in Alcoholics Anonymous, there's a book, we call it the big book. It's like the Alcoholic Bible. And it's about, basically it's the text, how do you get sober? The first 164 pages haven't been changed since 1939. And like 1939 is like still a long enough time ago that there's definitely been some discussions within the AA community about how, well, this languaging is not great, and they're starting to change some things, but it just made me really think about how, Paul was probably just as messy as like Bill W. and Bob, the guys that kind of started the big, like they were flying by the seat of their pants. They had no idea what they were doing, but they had this idea and they wrote this stuff down. And at the very end of the first piece, this text that tells you how to get sober and live in community, they have a chapter called A Vision for You. And at the very end of A Vision for You, to me, it sounds so much like this chapter. And what it says is, still you may say, but I will not have the benefit of contact with you who write this book. We cannot be sure. God will determine that. So you must remember that your real reliance is always upon God. God will show you how to create the fellowship you crave. Our book is meant to be suggestive only. We realize we know only a little. God will constantly disclose more to you and to us. Ask God in your morning meditation what you can do each day for the person who is still sick. The answers will come if your own house is in order, but obviously you cannot transmit something you haven't got. See to it that your relationship with God is right, and great events will come to pass for you and countless others. This is the great fact for us. Abandon yourself to God as you understand God. Admit your faults to God and to your fellows. Clear away the wreckage of your past. Give freely of what you find and join us. We shall be with you in the fellowship of the Spirit, and you will surely meet some of us as you trudge the road of happy destiny. May God bless you and keep you until then. So to me, that's like how it's all about how we can love one another.
Well said. Well, thank you for indulging our co-preaching. Maybe this is something you want to do sometime. Talk to us. We didn't even get to the greet each other with a holy kiss, which is probably the most controversial part of that whole passage. But we want to give you just a moment to reflect. And once maybe 30 to 60 seconds of this pub pass, Tony's going to come and lead us in some prayers.